You're going to be telling us 5 failed predictions of evolution today. So what are actually the 5 failed predictions?
Well, number one is that there should be no carbon-14 in diamonds. 2, there should be no carbon-14 in coal. 3 relates to the folding of rocks. 4 relates to bioturbation. 5 is convergent. So you take these things into account, you can quickly start to see how those dates come back into a biblical time frame.
That's actually amazing. So that we've cut down from billions of years to a few thousand. If you've been following along with our 5 failed predictions, we actually have a bonus number 6 for you right now. We're going to be talking about... Today, we're going to look at 5 predictions and see how they have fared. Have they been proven true or have they been falsified? Today, I have Don with me in the studio. Don has been working in his area of research for over 20 years, which is plant biology. So, Dr. Don Batten, you're going to be telling us 5 failed predictions of evolution today. What do you actually mean by failed prediction?
Well, science advances by failed predictions. People think about proving things, but in fact, we disprove things rather than prove things. So when you make a prediction, for example, a very simplistic prediction would be all horses are brown. So you can examine millions of horses that are brown and it doesn't prove that all horses are brown. All it takes is seeing one white horse and you've got a failed prediction. So observing lots of brown horses is a technical fallacy called affirming the consequent, which sounds complex, but it's actually a fallacy to say you've proven something. So you disprove things rather than prove things. So today I have another 5 failed predictions of cosmic evolution. And I have an article with 40 failed predictions, and that's not exhaustive, there's more.
This sounds like you've done some pretty extensive research into this. So what are actually the 5 failed predictions today then?
Well, number one is that there should be no carbon-14 in diamonds. Number 2, there should be no carbon-14 in coal. Number 3 relates to the folding of rocks. Number 4 relates to bioturbation, which I'll explain. And number 5 is convergence shouldn't exist. That is where you have extremely similar animals which come from different branches of the evolutionary family tree. They shouldn't be similar.
So if we get it started and kicked off, carbon-14 in diamonds. Carbon-14 shouldn't exist in diamonds based on cosmic evolution. How does that stand up?
Well, the diamonds are supposed to be 1 to 3 billion years old. That's 1,000 millions. Huge age they're supposed to be. And in which case there could not be any carbon-14 present in them, because carbon-14 is a radioactive element that decays away quite quickly. 5,730 years, half it disappears, which means that after even 100,000 years, there'd be nothing left. Well, when you've got a billion years, there's no way in the world there could be any left. And here's the thing, you can't contaminate a diamond with carbon-14 after it's made.
And so why is that so problematic with this sort of idea?
Well, the thing is that anybody who's done high school biology or high school science would know that carbon in a diamond is a crystal structure and it's a lattice, and every spot is taken up with a carbon. That's why it's so hard. And so you can't put carbon into it after it's made. So if the diamonds are 1 to 3 billion years old, you can't put carbon-14 into it in the last 50,000 years. You can't put it into it any time after it's made. So how can it be billions of years old if it has carbon-14 present?
Before we continue, a quick heads up. Stick around to the end of the interview because we'll be giving away a free stream of our award-winning documentary, Evolution's Achilles Heels. You won't want to miss it. Now back to the interview. So moving on to sort of the next idea then with carbon-14 as well. With coal, how does that work as well?
Well, it's a similar problem in that the coal is supposed to be anything from 10 to over 300 million years old, in which case there'd be no carbon-14 left in it if the carbon-14 was there at the beginning. Now, so some people try to explain this by contamination, but we'll get onto that. But coal we've found carbon-14 in every coal sample that's ever been looked at.
Right. So it's in every single bit of coal, even though it shouldn't be there.
Yeah, so basically when scientists were developing the carbon-14 dating system many decades ago, they wanted a organic sample which they could process, put through the processing that's used for carbon dating, and with something with no carbon-14 present. So they could check how much carbon-14 they were adding during the processing or the preparation of the samples. So they said, we'll go and get some coal because it's obviously got no carbon-14 in it because it's millions of years old. And they got a sample of coal and it had carbon-14 present. And they've been looking ever since for a sample with no carbon-14 and no one's found any. In fact, there was a paper written in the Radiocarbon Journal many years ago now where they were basically putting out the fact that they've been unable to find any samples of coal with no carbon-14. And
that's so interesting. And so with carbon-14 being in coal, is it just like crazy sort of erratic amounts of carbon-14 in there, or is it looking kind of nice and uniform?
It's fairly consistent actually, which is it's consistent with the coal forming from vegetation buried during Noah's flood.
Oh, right. And so how does that work then with carbon-14 being in coal and Noah's flood? What does that sort of look like? How would that process work?
Well, here's the thing. When you look at those coal samples, which are supposed to be anything from 10 to 300, over 300 million years old, they all have a similar amount of carbon-14 in them. Now, according to the carbon-14 dating, that's like 30 to 40,000 years old. And that's too old for Noah's flood, but we'll deal with that. And but the fact that there's a consistent amount, similar amount, is consistent with it all being formed by the same process, which would be vegetation buried during Noah's flood and then it's formed coal since then.
But surely, I mean, evolutionists will have an answer for this. What do they commonly say?
Well, there's three go-to attempts to answer this because you couldn't possibly accept this evidence because otherwise you stop believing in the millions and billions of years. So the first one is contamination. That's the usual go-to. And the idea is that these samples have been contaminated, and they have to be contaminated in recent times. You can remember that carbon-14 would all decay away in something like 50 or 60,000 years. You not be able to measure any. Certainly 100,000 years, you can't measure anything. There's nothing there. So consequently, the contamination has to be recent. And all these samples that are supposed to be over 300 million years, or the diamonds, can't be contaminated, so that rules that out with diamonds. So the contamination thing, though, is checked in the process of carbon dating. So in the laboratory, they check what's called carbon-13, carbon-12 ratio. Sounds technical, and it is. But why do they do that? They do that because if the carbon-14 comes from organic material from plants, which all of it has to, because photosynthesis locks it into food and then things eat the plants, and so the animal that eats the plant has the same carbon-14 that the plant had. And similar to algae in the ocean, and fish eat the algae and they get the carbon-14 from the algae. It's all from photosynthesis, but the different plants and algae have a different enzymes which take up the CO2, the carbon dioxide, and they discriminate against something which is not carbon-12. So carbon-12 is a normal carbon dioxide, carbon-14 is radioactive carbon dioxide, and carbon-13, though, is also different to carbon-12, but it's slightly heavier. And the enzyme discriminates against the carbon-13 carbon dioxide. And the carbon-13 carbon-12 ratio is constant. It doesn't decay like the carbon-14 does. And so you can look at the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 and you can see that the organic matter that's being checked for carbon-14 hasn't been contaminated. It's actually from plants. It's actually, in fact, there's two different sorts of plants in terms of their chemistry of photosynthesis. You can even tell which sort of plant it is or whether it's algae.
Right, yes.
So is it contamination? No, clearly not contamination. That's checked for in the actual process of carbon dating.
Right. So number one, is it contaminated? you can test for that, and the answer is no.
No, not contamination.
Not contaminated. Well, there's two more options. What are the other two options?
So the second option is uranium can decay to produce some carbon-14. So the normal uranium decay chain takes you through to lead. But there's a side chain with a tiny, tiny percentage of it can actually go to carbon-14.
Okay.
So the idea is that there's contamination or small amounts of uranium in the actual samples, in the vegetation, which became coal or whatever, which has produced the carbon-14. Now, again, it has to happen in the last 50,000 years. So if this happened, a million years ago, it's not going to help.
Doesn't matter anymore.
And here's the problem. It's such a tiny amount of carbon-14 produced by the uranium decay that for it to produce enough carbon-14 to be significant, to be measurable, to give you a carbon-14 age, the sample would have to be 99% uranium.
Right, and we're pretty sure when we're dealing with coal,
it's not uranium.
It's not uranium.
Exactly right.
So
that doesn't work.
We have a bit of a problem there then. So it can't be contaminated. We know it's not contaminated. We can test that. We know it's not 99% uranium, so it's not producing carbon-14 through that method. What is their final option?
The third one is that the normal process of production of carbon-14 in the atmosphere is that a nitrogen-14 is hit by a neutron, a cosmic ray type of thing, in the upper atmosphere, and the neutron's absorbed by the nitrogen and produces carbon-14. So that's how carbon-14 is normally produced. The idea is that nitrogen in the vegetation, which has become coal, had some nitrogen in it, and nearby some radioactive decay of other material produced neutrons which bombarded the nitrogen and made it into carbon-14. That's how you got the carbon-14 in the sample. It has to happen, all has to happen recently. It's no good at it happening millions of years ago. It has to happen in the last 50,000 years. And what's the chances of that happening?
Pretty low.
Very, very low. And it would produce such a tiny amount, it wouldn't be significant. So, and also, if this was an explanation for the carbon-14 present, you would expect the amount of carbon-14 to be proportional to the amount of nitrogen in the sample.
Yes.
Not the case.
Not the case.
In fact, as we said earlier, the coal samples all have a similar amount of carbon-14, but there's a huge range of nitrogen levels in these things. So it doesn't explain it at all.
Right. So we've got three options, two of which are sort of outright wrong, and one that would be, you would have to have a very specific scenario for it to work, and it's not looking very likely. So overall, there's no real explanation for this that has come forward that has been compelling at all.
There's no explanation that works. In fact, I had a meeting with a bunch of scientists in Adelaide, 2023, and they were very resistant of the idea the Earth could be young. So and when I brought up the question of carbon dating and how strong evidence against their belief for millions and billions of years, they were very resistant to the idea. In fact, they're a bit hostile. But their go-to was contamination.
Yes.
Contamination. And I explained how the carbon-14 dating system works and how it's checked for in the process of processing the samples. And the most vocal opponent of what I was talking about went very silent. And he privately emailed me later and said that's very powerful evidence against millions and billions of years. So the people who, some of the comments on the internet about our material on carbon dating have put forward, oh, you don't understand carbon dating, it's residual, which means it's contamination. These people making these statements actually don't understand the carbon dating process because it's checked for in the way in which the samples are dealt with in the lab for carbon dating.
So this is a big thorn in the side, the carbon-14 problem, for those people who think this is a long, long period of time, billions of years, natural processes, where this sort of doesn't really line up particularly well with that entire idea.
It should be a thorn in their side, but they give trite answers. But if they go into it and actually research it, it is a huge problem for the millions of years story. A huge problem.
How much time would that actually shave off of their sort of time scale if what you're saying is true?
Well, you think about the diamonds, 1 to 3 billion years, and if they're dated at, the dating is 40 or 50,000 years, that takes off billions of years of time.
We're working in the tens of thousands of years then, aren't we?
Yeah, well, this gets rid of billions of years. I mean, the coal, as we said, is 10 to 300 million years old, and it brings it all into the last 40,000 years or so, according to their own dating. This gets rid of deep time. It effectively gets rid of deep time.
And yeah, that's so interesting. So we're still working with tens of thousands of years though, and how does that line up with biblical accounts of time if we look at genealogies and whatnot?
Yeah, we look at of course at the biblical time frame is shorter than 40 or 50,000 years. So how does it compute? Well, with the carbon dating, what they do is they've got a calibration in historical times, which makes it quite useful in archaeology, or even there, sometimes it gets strange results. So they never take it in isolation. It's always in the context of what we know about the history. So in archaeological times, we can calibrate it. But once you go past that, when you start talking about 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years, it's just a straight line extrapolation back into the past.
Yeah.
In other words, it's totally assumed. Well, is that valid? They don't take account of the fact that Noah's flood was a global flood, and that would have a major effect on the carbon dating system.
Yes.
And also, if you look at the fact that prior to the flood, the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere was at least 15 times what it is now. And there's a secular view of, the Cambrian period had 15 times as much carbon dioxide as we have now. So 15 times as much carbon dioxide is basically over 20,000 years of carbon dating because of the dilution effect on the carbon-14.
Yes, okay.
Right? So it makes things look older. So you can lock 20 to 23, 24,000 years off those 40,000 year ages or whatever you like. You take into account the dilution effect in Noah's flood. So you've got all this vegetation buried during Noah's flood, which became the coal we're talking about. And then after the flood, there's a regrowth of the vegetation, sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, a radical effect on the carbon dating system.
Right.
So you take these two things into account, you can quickly start to see how those dates come back into a biblical time frame.
That's actually amazing. So that we've cut down from billions of years to a few thousand.
Yeah.
So Don, what's the third failed prediction then?
Well, the prediction is that folded rocks around the world give evidence that they were hard when they were folded.
Right. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Well, if you think about the rock, the deep time idea of rocks being laid down, layer after layer after layer like this, and then you find all around the world radical bending of these rock layers. So clearly all the stuff was laid down before it was folded, before it was bent.
Right.
But the time frame they put on this, again, the millions and billions of years idea, you've got tens and hundreds of millions of years of time laying down these layers before they're bent.
Yes.
In which case, at least the lower layers would have been hard rock at the time they were bent.
Yeah, okay. That
so
makes sense.
How do you bend hard rock?
I don't know. Can you bend hard rock?
Well, you can bend hard rock if you have enough force.
Okay.
But when you do that, the force is so extreme that it changes the nature of the rock.
Right. So something becomes something else.
Yeah. So, for example, sandstone becomes quartzite and limestone becomes marble. And also you get sand grains will be distorted by the force. And so you would also expect to find some cracking, a lot of cracking from the bending of the rock. I mean, you bend hard rock, surely something's going to crack. You don't see much cracking.
And so what's the other option here then? It had to be soft while bending. Is that more likely?
Well, the prediction is, of course, it was hard when it was bent, in which case it should leave telltale signs it was hard when it was bent. When you look at it, actually it looks like it was soft when it was bent.
All right. And has there been sort of any scientific research done on this?
Yes, indeed. In fact, there's a major fold in the Grand Canyon called the Kaibab Upwarp, where virtually all the layers in the Grand Canyon are radically bent.
Right.
And there's a fold connected with that called the Monument Fold, very thick layer of rock, all is radically bent.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Andrew Snelling, a geologist, wanted to do a research project map to check whether it was hard when it was bent or whether it was soft.
Okay. And so surely that's not something that's too difficult to get done then? You just go take a sample out?
Well, you have to get permission from the Parks Authority to do it.
And what kind of, did he run into some problems then?
He did, indeed. So he applied to the Parks Authority in 2013 to do the research. They refused to let him do it. They refused to let him get the samples.
They didn't let him get any samples?
No.
They didn't want him testing that?
No.
That's not very open-minded of science there.
No, it's not very open-minded at all.
And so did he end up actually getting the sample then?
Well, he did, but only after legal action. So a group that defends religious freedom in the United States, which is guaranteed under their constitution, sued the National Parks Authority for permission. It said it's viewpoint discrimination. It's discriminating against somebody on the basis of their religious beliefs, and that's illegal under the US Constitution.
Okay, so he got some samples after legal action.
After 4 years after he initially applied, in 2017, he took the samples.
It's a long time to wait. And what did he find? Did he was able to do some of the tests, and what was the evidence?
Yeah, well, I think the Parks Authority people realised that if he did the research, it would probably not be in favour of their view about how long everything took to form. And that's what he found. It's a major research project where he looked at the samples under a geological microscope, where you can look at things like, were the sand grains distorted?
Mm-hmm.
And was there any metamorphosis, in other words, changing of sandstone into quartzite or anything like that? And lots of other checks as well. But everything that he looked at said this stuff was soft when it was bent. Wow.
So they kind of knew that this might not be a favourable move for their beliefs of how it was created.
It sort of looks like they didn't want the research done because they suspected it might not be in favour of their millions of years story.
And so what does that actually mean for the millions of years stories then?
Well, that fold represents 480 million years of evolutionary time. In other words, the time between the bottom layer being laid down and the top layer being laid down, between the bottom layer laid down and the folding, 480 million years.
Right. And if
that was all soft when it was bent, it eliminates nearly 500 million years of evolutionary time.
So again, we're losing millions of years.
We're losing substantial slabs of deep time. In fact, if you think about the Phanerozoic, which is the fossil-bearing strata, it's a section of the geologic column that has fossils, a lot of fossils in it, Phanerozoic. It's supposed to be 541 million years, according to radiometric dating.
Yes, okay.
And this research wipes out 90% of that time.
So that might have had to have been created pretty soon and pretty quickly as well.
Well, it indicates that it was laid down very quickly and bent before it could become hard. So it was laid down very quickly and bent before it could become hard, which compresses all that time into a very short time. It's consistent with the material being laid down during Noah's flood, very quickly over the year of the flood, and then the bending occurred near the end of the flood or soon after the flood with the tectonic forces and things which were operating on the Earth at the time.
Right. And so this sort of research that's done, it's genuine research. How was that received by the mainstream sort of research and science community?
Well, the fact he was refused permission to do the research shows you it's not popular.
No.
It's not popular. But the deep time idea is so entrenched that people just, they shake their eye, well, there must be some explanation.
Yeah.
There must be some explanation. But there isn't. There isn't an explanation.
That is, again, a very interesting topic to dive into, and there's no real answer we've got so far from other scientists.
Well, it completely contradicts their expectations, which is a seriously failed prediction.
Seriously failed prediction. Well, we're on a roll here. We've got 3 failed predictions down, up to number 4. You mentioned a word, bioturbation. What is bioturbation?
Yeah, that's a mouthful, but it's basically the stirring up that occurs with creatures that live on the seafloor or on the lake floor. Things like pippies. I have a fossil of one here. So this is a fossil of a bivalve. It tells its own story, but we won't go there. But these things, if you've been fishing, I believe.
I've been fishing a couple of times. I'm not an avid fisher, but I've done it.
But you've done the thing on the beach with your toes, and you dig into the sand and get these pippies out.
Not with my toes, but yeah, we've got some pippies along the way.
Well, you can do them with your toes. You get there and you wiggle your toes into the thing, and you can feel them with your toes, and you've got to quick and whip them out of the sand. And if you're quick and grab them, you can then use them for fish bait. So these things, if you don't grab them quickly, they burrow back into the sand really quickly.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens with the tides and everything, they come up out of the sand to feed and they go back into the sand. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of other creatures like this that stir up the sand. There's worms and all sorts of shellfish and things that stir up the sand. And these things have been in the fossil record all the way back to the bottom of the so-called Phanerozoic, which is all the fossil-bearing strata. So if you're laying down sediment, sand, silt and mud depositing on a seafloor or a lake floor, these creatures are stirring it up all the time.
Right. And
now the prediction is...
I was actually about to ask that. What is the prediction here then? We know what bioturbation is, and we know they're busy disturbing sediment on the seafloor. What does that actually mean? What is the prediction here?
The thing is that if the sediments were laid down over the time frame they claim, there's such a small amount of sediment each year that it would all be stirred up.
Right.
So there'd be no structure in the rock.
At all. So it would all be stirred up by these pippies and whatnot, coming up for feeding, going down, stirring up all the sediment, and that wouldn't actually have nice formations of rock. No
nice. Everybody's seen through road cuttings and things like that. You see the layers in the rock and that sort of thing. And a lot of them are horizontal, sometimes bent, but you see the layers in the rock. And the layers wouldn't be there. They'd be all stirred up. In fact, experiments have been done with these creatures, and within an hour or so, they stir up a depth of 100 millimetres, 10 centimetres, 4 inches. Within an hour or so, it's stirred up.
Right. And how much sediment is expected with the old sort of idea? How much sediment has to be laid there and stay there?
Well, if you divide the thickness of the Phanerozoic, which is about 2 kilometres, that's the fossil-bearing strata, and they say it's 541 million years. Get your calculator out. Divide 2 kilometres by 541 million years.
Okay.
The answer is 0.004 millimetres per year of sediment.
That has to be laid and undisturbed.
Well, and it's a tenth the thickness of a sheet of paper per year.
And we can already see that these pippies and whatnot are already stirring up more than that in an hour.
That's correct. They're stirring up much more than that in an hour. So in other words, to get structure in the rock, there must be much more than 100 millimetres per hour deposited to actually not get the stirring up.
Right, and we don't see that at all.
No. In fact, 2 scientists, Dr. Leonard Brand and Dr. Art Chadwick in the United States, did a major study of this, and they looked at the rock layers between the Cambrian and the Eocene. That's sort of basically the whole thing in Utah and Arizona in the United States, which has been well studied rock-wise. There's been a lot of study done by all sorts of geologists on this. Mm-hmm. And they looked at they graded the bioturbation. They had a scale of 1 to 5. And they graded the bioturbation, no bioturbation through to heavily bioturbated, in other words, all stirred up and no structure, versus, no stirring. Mm-hmm. And almost all of it was unstirred. There's just very little that's actually stirred up.
So what would have to happen for this to actually be the case, for what we see to have an explanation if these pippies and things are stirring it all up?
Well, there's no explanation other than the fact that the time is fictional.
Right.
The amount of time is fictional. So the go-to is, there's been a period of rapid sedimentation, and that's where we get the structure.
Yeah.
And then there's periods where there's nothing happening, and that's where the time is. You see, it's in the gaps. That's the idea.
Okay.
So that was a popular idea, but this study showed that there's actually no gaps, because if you had gaps in time, you'd have bioturbation. You'd have no structure. But there's structure almost all the way through it, so there's no gaps. There's no periods of quiescence, no periods of long time where hardly anything's happening.
Right. And so does that mean there had to be rapid time, like this would have to have occurred rapidly?
The whole lot has to be deposited really rapidly in quick time, otherwise you'd have it all stirred up.
Oh, right, okay.
It's like, again, Noah's flood explains the formation of these layers in quick time. And by the way, the pippy, or the bivalve here, when it's fossilised, is intact.
Yeah.
When you find these shells on the beach, you just find half of it.
Yeah.
Because when they die, the little muscle inside that holds it together, it falls apart.
Okay.
But when you find them as fossils, they're like this. They're actually buried alive.
Buried alive. So that was a fossil that actually occurred before that could die.
Yeah, it had to be buried to become a fossil like that, buried alive. So it couldn't come out. So it had to be buried with sufficient stuff, more than 10 centimetres, more than 4 inches, so that it couldn't actually get out above the sediment. So it's got to be buried with masses of sediment. So we're talking about huge amounts of sediment formed on these things to make them into fossils. And really quickly.
Are they like a common sort of thing to find actually that's
quite common, yeah.
So this isn't just like maybe in one area there was a freak incident that buried a whole bunch of pippies. This is actually like a very common thing to find.
Right through the fossil record, you find soft-bodied creatures and things that had to be buried quickly to become fossils.
Right. So there's a very common and had to be buried quickly and in enough sediment that it couldn't escape.
So the bioturbation study, it really eliminates this huge amount of time. It says that the time frame that they've given for all this sedimentation is just wrong by many orders of magnitude. I mean, like 100 million times wrong.
Right. Okay.
That sort of order of magnitude, because from 0.004 millimetres per year, 1/10 the thickness of a sheet of paper, you're not going to get fossils. You're going to get complete bioturbation. It doesn't figure. The millions and billions of years story does not make sense of the physical evidence. It's another major fail for the evolutionary predictions.
And with that, there's no get-out-of-jail-free card here. Like we had some other sort of answers with the previous predictions where, there was contamination or something like that, where you had to do some refuting. But is there any sort of get-out-of-jail-free card here?
Well, the only one is one we mentioned, which is the idea that there's been a period of rapid sedimentation, and then there's periods of nothing happening. But it doesn't work, because this study shows that there's never been a period of nothing happening.
Exactly.
Almost no periods of nothing happening.
So yet another failed prediction then.
Yeah, a strongly failed prediction.
We're going to hit the final point here. We got up to number 5, failed prediction number 5. You mentioned convergent evolution. Can you explain what that actually is?
So convergent evolution is where you find creatures with similar features that could not have a common ancestor, which explains the common features. So, for example, you have red hair, and one of your parents has probably got red hair.
That's true, my mum does.
That's right, your mum's got red hair. So you have a common ancestor. You have an ancestor. So you might have a brother or sister with red hair, and the reason you both have red hair is because you've got a common ancestor, your mother, who's got red hair, which passed it on to you.
Yeah, okay.
But this is a case where creatures have similarities which can't have a common ancestor.
Right.
So, for example, with marsupial animals and placental animals. So your placental animals are things like dogs and cats and cows and us.
Yeah.
But the marsupial animals are things like kangaroos and wombats. But your marsupials have a pouch, basically.
Yeah.
Opossums in America, possums in Australia, tree kangaroos. But the really interesting thing is that there are all sorts of versions of marsupials, which there are very, very similar placental mammals. And the most extreme of these are things like marsupial mole, which actually burrows under the ground. There's a placental mole which burrows under the ground. Look at them, they're almost identical in their appearance, except the one has a pouch. You also have a phalanger, like it's a flying possum type thing, it glides rather than flies, and you have a flying squirrel, and almost identical appearance. You have a marsupial mouse and a placental mouse, and you've got to pick them up to look for the pouch to tell the difference. There's a marsupial rat and a placental rat, and so on. So these creatures have so many similarities, uncanny similarities, and yet they can't have a common ancestor that explains those because, see, you've got to trace marsupials. All the marsupials came from a common ancestor back here. So in other words, a marsupial mouse, a placental mouse, and the flying phalanger, and all these different marsupials arose from a common ancestor back here, which was the first marsupial.
Yeah.
And of course, the placental animals all had a common ancestor back here, which was the sort of first placental mammal.
Okay, yeah.
So then they had a common ancestor way back here, which is some sort of reptile or something.
Yeah.
But you don't have any explanation for the similarities between the marsupial mouse and the placental mouse. It's just a fluke.
That they look so similar, but they're not from the common ancestor.
That's right. So in other words, evolution cannot explain them.
So what actually is the failed prediction here then?
So Stephen Jay Gould was a very well-known American paleontologist and biologist and evolutionist. And he was at Chicago Field Museum of Natural History, a very highly published guy. And he pointed out that because evolution is based on random mutations, there's no way in the world that evolution could produce in a different experiment, could produce the same creature.
Yes, yeah.
In other words, if you ran the evolution experiment again, you wouldn't get what we have today. That's what he's saying.
You'd get something completely different.
Something really
random chance.
So here's a prediction. An evolutionary prediction is that evolution would not produce two creatures which are almost identical.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Because it's based on random mutations. But we find all these creatures which are so many similarities. In fact, this whole book's been written about this, about the problem it is for evolution and trying to explain it. And in fact, they have a technical term called homoplasy.
Homoplasy.
Which is similarities which are not due to evolution.
Wow.
And they even try to claim these differences as something to do with evolution by calling it convergent evolution. But convergence is a problem for evolution, a huge problem.
And so we know that natural selection is a thing. Do you think that environments could have played a part in animals looking similar, or is that just too far-fetched?
Well, that's the argument. The argument is, they evolved to look the same because they evolved in the same environment or similar environment. But the similarities are so profound that doesn't really wash. And I mean, you look at a kangaroo, for example, and it walks quite differently to a cow or a sheep.
Yeah.
Its mode of operation, mode of movement is very, very different. I think God actually created kangaroos just to sort of thwart that idea that, given the same environment, you get the same animal,
In fact, we have animals in the same environment that look vastly different, that have different functions. Even in Australia, we have some pretty crazy looking animals and they've all had the same environment. So that would kind of disprove that they would have to look the same to survive in the same environment. Okay. Well, we've talked about how we've had some common ancestors, ancestors that aren't actually common, but some common looking traits with animals. Is there anything that's on like a molecular level that is similar?
Yeah, there's some really good ones. Well, probably the most extreme one is where sonar in bats and dolphins.
Yes.
So everybody would know about that. So the insectivorous bats, for example, have sonar and they're quite amazing at picking up insects and things on the wing. And then dolphins have sonar. When they start looking at the molecular basis of the sonar, in other words, the genes involved, they found about 200 genes which are similar between bats and dolphins.
And they don't look similar at all.
Well, they can't have a common ancestor that explains that.
No. Wow. And so what does that actually mean then for that being a failed prediction? Do you reckon that's a nail in the coffin? That's too...
It's extreme, and it's an extreme problem for the storytelling, which says that mutations and natural selection over millions of years could produce extreme similarities at the molecular level, in the gene level, with 200 genes similar. It stretches credulity enormously.
Yeah, and is there any other failed predictions of biological evolution that come off the top of your head?
Well, I mean, the expectation is that life is simple because otherwise it couldn't be explained by evolution, and we find that life is not simple at all. It's incredibly complex. And previously we've done things like the junk DNA idea. It's a huge failure for the evolutionary thinking to believe that we're full of junk DNA.
Yeah, which we've soon found actually has purposes that we didn't quite understand before.
Well, we still don't understand much of the purpose, and that's a long way to go.
I hope you're enjoying this interview so far. Creating content like this takes a considerable amount of time, effort, and resources. We're passionate about getting this message out, and we want to keep bringing you more videos like this one. But here's the thing, we need your help to make that happen. Your support, no matter how big or small, will help us cover our production costs and enable us to continue creating impactful content. To support this project, just use the link in the description below or the on-screen prompt. We're so thankful for your support. So if you've been following along, we've actually had our 5 failed predictions already, but we actually miscounted. Those carbon-14 ones were meant to be paired together. We actually have a bonus number 6 for you right now. We're going to be talking about the idea of sexual selection. What actually is that, Don?
So this goes way back to Darwin, and he was bothered by the fact that male birds are ostentatious. They have bright feathers and things, and particularly the peacock, which he said made him feel sick trying to explain it from an evolution point of view. He wrote that in a letter in 1860. In Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, he proposed that a peacock has this amazing tail because the females like males with amazing tails.
Okay.
So he called it sexual selection. So the prediction is that the amazing features of male birds, particularly, and other creatures, are due to sexual selection. In other words, the females like the ones with the showy features, and that's why they have them.
Right, and that sort of makes sense in my head. But you say it's a failed prediction. What's going on here then? Well,
people believed this for a long time, but not long ago, some Japanese scientists set out to prove it. In other words, they set out to prove that the females liked the showy males. So they rated the tails of these wild population, and they rated them for their size and the number of eye spots and things like that. And then they monitored the matings, and there were 268 matings over 7 years that they monitored.
Oh, right. So plenty of data here.
Plenty of data, plenty of observations, and they found zero relationship between how showy the tails were and how successful they were at mating. So the idea is that the ones with the showy tails would have more matings and pass on their genes to the offspring, and that's what brought about the showy tails to start with.
Right. So if the showy tails are not for mating, having a showy tail doesn't seem like a particularly practical, or I guess like if you were evolving to an environment, you wouldn't want to have something that's slowing you down and making you a huge target to some kind of predator, right? So,
well, I mean, you'd be more obvious to a predator for a start.
Your giant tail is not
and this massive
practical.
tail means you can't duck between the trees and into the bushes and get away from predators. That's right.
So what is the advantage here of having this tail?
Well, good question. And you would think that since it doesn't help with their mating, and under normal situations, you'd expect predators and things to be after them. And it would hamper their ability to escape. You would think that the sexual selection must be very strong for it to overcome the negative side of having such a tail. But obviously, the Japanese scientists could find no relationship. And it must be a strong relationship to overcome the negative side.
Yes.
I mean, the effort you put into making the tail to start with.
It's like a large portion of their body. If the peahens didn't prefer sexually to have big tail that's bright and colourful, can you explain like the intricate design of the tail then? Why does it look that way?
Well, the design of the tail is sort of sidestepped by this whole thing, because the Darwin's thing, it explains the tail, but how does it explain the origin of the genes which actually specify how to make such an elaborate tail? With all the eye spots and, the colour in the tail is actually not due to pigments, like red and yellow pigments and things like that, or green, but it's due to refraction. So the little scales on the feathers actually aligned in a precise way to actually reflect the light. So the only colour in the peacock's tail is melanin, which is a brown colour pigment, and yet it's all those amazing colours. They're due to reflection of light with these little scales and things. So there must be quite an intricate design written into the DNA to how to make this. So that's the first thing. If the females did prefer a showy tail, no, they don't. How would that explain the origin of it? It doesn't. And the flip side of that is the females would need genes which said, you prefer a male with a showy tail.
Okay.
So you need both these things to come together for sexual selection to work, and it doesn't explain the origin of the features.
So you've got a showy tail. Where'd this even come from to start with? And how the peahens would have actually had to have like genetically thought that was cooler as well and, mate with them.
The instinct must be to want males with showy tails.
So if this is the case that, this is the peacocks don't actually benefit from really having a showy tail sexually, and it's not beneficial really for them in any kind of environment for survival, does this sort of make Darwin's theory of sexual selection a little bit dead in the water?
So this is another serious blow to the idea, the cosmic evolution idea, that everything made itself over billions of years and without any purpose or anything like that.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think a lot of people here, if they were watching it and they did believe that cosmic evolution was, in fact, the answer, they would probably tell us that this is how science works, actually. We make a prediction, we observe what happens, and then we go back to our original prediction and change it. So what would you say to that?
Yes, somebody has said that well, this is how science works. You have a failed prediction and you just modify your theory, so. But these are not just minor tweakings. These are major failures. And if what they say is true, it means that evolution is irrefutable scientifically. It's unfalsifiable. And in fact, some people have actually admitted that it's not falsifiable. I think it is falsifiable, but some of the evolutionists themselves have actually said that.
Yeah.
So Professor Charles Birch and Paul Ehrlich, in a Nature paper some years ago, said something which I'd like to actually get exactly right. So I read it out to make sure I'm not misquoting them. But this is Professor Charles Birch and Paul Ehrlich in Nature magazine, the world's top science journal, and quoting, "Our theory of evolution has become, as Popper described," he was a philosopher of science, "one which cannot be refuted by any possible observations. Every conceivable observation can be fitted into it. It is thus outside of empirical science, but not necessarily false. No one can think of ways in which to test it." So this is where these people are coming from. Basically, evolution's a fact, we don't need to test it.
Yeah.
So no matter what you say, no matter what evidence you present, no matter what predictions fail, they'll stick to it.
Right. It's an unfalsifiable truth at this point in their minds.
Yeah. So if they want to say that evolution is not science, I'm happy to go there. I totally agree with them, which is effectively what they're saying by saying that no matter what failed predictions there are, evolution stands. They're basically saying evolution, not science, and I'm happy to go there. I agree it's not science.
Yeah, and so you mentioned Charles Birch, the professor. I think we were chatting earlier, and you actually knew Charles Birch. How did you find him?
He was actually a professor at the University of Sydney when I was doing my studies there, and he's an interesting character. He used to have lunchtime lectures, and what student would go along to a voluntary lecture by one of your lecturers, at
Definitely
lunchtime?
Not me. Definitely not me.
But he was an interesting character, and he presented very interesting lectures. And so I remember going along to one of these lectures at lunchtime, and place was full, the lecture theatre was full. And he said something which really rocked me, really impacted me. He said, "Some of you students are worried about evolution." He said, "Don't worry too much about it. I don't know whether I believe it myself." And I said, "What? What did he just say?"
Believe it.
I don't know whether he's a professor of biology. I don't know whether I believe it myself. I think, is he talking about science or is he talking about religion, And at that stage, I wasn't clear in my mind what I thought about evolution. I was trying to, I thought I had to believe it. And that sort of went into my brain and it sort of lodged there, believe. Am I believing evolution? I thought, is this a religion or is it science?
Yeah, well, you shouldn't have to believe something if it has empirical evidence. It's just that is the facts and that is the reality.
That's the way it is, yeah. So anyway, I'm sure he didn't intend that to cause me to take a journey away from believing in evolution, but that was one of the things that impacted me at the time and led me to start to think about this and realise that it really doesn't have legs.
Well, Don, we've talked about a lot of failed predictions today, 6 to be exact. We were aiming for 5, but we got one extra here. It's been phenomenally interesting, and I hear that there's actually a resource that you have, a documentary that also is talking about these same topics. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yes, indeed. Evolution's Achilles' heels. It's all about failed predictions of evolution, actually, and many more than 5 or 6. This is actually 15 PhD scientists were involved in producing this documentary, all speaking within their own fields and things, and it's powerfully done with illustrations and animations, and I think people would find it very, very helpful to realise that evolution, cosmic evolution, is a failed prediction. It's a failed theory, and it should be discarded. So this is something that I'd highly recommend.
And we are actually going to make this available as a free stream, and the link is in the description if you want to go check that out. Thanks, Don, for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure to hear you talk about the failed predictions of cosmic evolution. I've had a great time, and I hope that everyone watching has also had just as great a time as I have. Look forward to doing further interviews with you later.
Thanks, James. Thank you.